Hello, incurable romantics. Prepare to travel back in time. Get ready for a story that will sweep you off your feet. If you love drama and romance, subscribe to our channel. The air in Walter Thorne's private office, tucked away behind the shimmering chaos of the gilded cage, was thick enough to be bottled. It was a potent cocktail of Cuban cigar smoke, the oaky ghost of spilled whiskey, and the silent, heavy weight of power. Outside, a jazz trio sent a river of saxophone notes flowing through the speakeasy, a siren song for the city's restless souls. But in here, the only music was the quiet clink of ice in a crystal tumbler and the steady, dangerous rhythm of Walter's thoughts. He stood before the large bay window, his formidable silhouettes stark against the rain-slicked Chicago streets below. At 32, Walter Thorne was not a man of loud proclamations. His influence was a quiet, creeping vine that had wrapped itself around the city's heart, squeezing when necessary. He owned the night, from the illegal gin that flowed in his establishments to the politicians who drank it. Yet his expression, reflected faintly in the dark glass, was not one of triumph. It was one of profound, gnawing solitude. His gaze drifted to a small, silver-framed photograph on his mahogany desk. A man with an easy smile and honest eyes, flanked by a woman with a gentle face. Stanley and Hazel Kowalski. Between them, a small boy who couldn't be more than 5. Stanley had been more than just an enforcer. He'd been loyal to a fault, a rare currency in their world. He had taken a bullet meant for Walter 2 years ago, and his last, gasping words were not a curse, but a plea. "My boy, Walter, promise me." My Arthur, a promise was a debt, and Walter Thorne always paid his debts. He downed the rest of his whiskey in one smooth motion, the burn of familiar companion. He had spent the last year arranging the pieces, pulling strings with judges and city officials, ensuring every legal document was an ironclad fortress. Today, he would collect on that promise. Today, he would bring the boy home. His driver, a stoic man named Eugene, held the door of the Ford Model T open. The vehicle was a sleek black beast, its polished lacquer gleaming under the weak afternoon sun that had finally broken through the clouds. As they drove away from the opulent heart of the city towards the humbler, grittier neighborhood where the St. Jude orphanage resided, the world shifted. The grand stone facades of banks and department stores gave way to brick tenements, with laundry lines strung between them like weary banners. The orphanage was a large, formidable brick building, its austerity softened only by the brightly colored, albeit chipped, paint on its window boxes and the sound of children's laughter spilling from the yard. It smelled of lye soap, boiled cabbage, and a determined sort of hope. It was a world away from Walter's. It was clean. He stepped out of the car, his tailored wool suit and polished leather shoes, an immediate declaration of otherness. A few children stopped their game of stickball to stare, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Walter ignored them, his focus singular, as he ascended the worn stone steps and pushed open the heavy oak door. The inside was spare but immaculate. A stern-faced matron with a tightly wound bun looked up from her desk, her gaze sweeping over him with disapproval. "I am here to see the boy." "Arthur Kowalski," Walter stated, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the light in the room. He placed a leather folio on her desk. "The papers are in order. Judge Davies signed off this morning." The matron, Mrs. Gable, reluctantly opened the folio, her lips thinning as she recognized the official seals. She was a gatekeeper, but she knew a battering ram when she saw one. "Miss Hayes is with the children in the classroom." "He's with her. I'll fetch them." Walter nodded, his eyes scanning the hallway. On the walls hung children's drawings, lopsided houses with plumes of smoke, stick-figure families holding hands. They were crude, simple, and represented a life so alien to his own, it might as well have been from another planet. He felt a familiar hollowness in his chest, a void that all the money and power in the world had failed to fill. Then he heard her voice. It was calm and clear, a melodic counterpoint to the shuffling of small feet. And so the brave knight knew that his greatest strength wasn't in his sword, but in his kindness. He turned towards the sound, an open doorway that led into a large, sunlit room. And there she was. Lillian Hayes stood before a group of children seated on a worn rug, a book held open in her hands. Sunlight from the tall windows caught the warm, honeyed tones in her brown hair, which was pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple drop-waist dress of pale blue cotton, practical and devoid of the fripperies of the flappers who frequented his clubs. She wasn't beautiful in the loud, painted way he was accustomed to. Hers was a quiet, luminous beauty, radiating from a source deep within. Her face was animated as she read, her eyes, the color of warm moss, sparkling with the story she was telling. In that moment, she was the embodiment of everything his world was not: light, innocence, selfless devotion. Mrs. Gable cleared her throat from the doorway. "Miss Hayes, a moment, please." Lillian's story came to a halt. She looked up, her smile fading as her gaze fell upon Walter. Her eyes, which had been so full of warmth, instantly became guarded. She saw the expensive suit, the imposing stillness of his posture, the cold, unreadable expression on his face. She saw a wolf who had wandered into her sheep pen. She rose gracefully, placing the book on her chair. "Yes, Mrs. Gable. This is Mr. Thorne," the matron said, her voice stiff. "He is here for Arthur." Lillian's back straightened. Her gaze shot from Walter to the small, dark-haired boy sitting near the front, his head bent over a wooden block. "Arthur." Walter followed her look. The boy was small for his 8 years, with his father's dark hair and his mother's solemn eyes. "I see," Lillian said, her voice losing its melodic quality, replaced by a cool, protective edge. She walked towards Walter, deliberately placing herself between him and the children. The adoption papers were finalized then. It was not a question, but a statement of bitter resignation. They were, Walter confirmed, his eyes fixed on hers. He had expected procedural hurdles, perhaps a tearful farewell. He had not expected this quiet, fierce defiance. He had not expected to be so thoroughly captivated by it. "Arthur is a sensitive boy, Mr. Thorne. He has known a great deal of loss," she said, her voice low but firm, a clear challenge. "He requires patience, gentleness, a stable home." Her eyes flicked over him again, and her meaning was clear. He possessed none of those qualities. Walter felt a flicker of something he rarely experienced, the need to explain himself. He crushed it instantly. "I am aware of the boy's history. That is why I am here." "Are you?" she countered, her courage surprising him. "Or are you here to soothe a guilty conscience? Men like you." She stopped herself, catching the sharp glint in his eyes. She was a teacher in an orphanage. He was a man who could buy and sell the building she stood in without a second thought. But she did not back down. She simply stood her ground, a lone guardian at the gate. "Men like me keep their promises," he said, the words coming out colder than he intended. Mrs. Gable, sensing the dangerous current in the air, intervened. "Arthur," she called, her voice sharp. "Come here, child. Mr. Thorne is here to take you to your new home." The boy looked up, his large, dark eyes wide and searching. He glanced at Walter, then immediately to Lillian, his expression pleading for reassurance. Lillian's face softened instantly as she looked at him. She knelt down, taking his small hands in hers. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice once again the gentle melody Walter had first heard. "This is a new adventure, remember? Like in the stories." The boy said nothing, merely clutching her hand tighter. Walter watched the exchange, a strange, unwelcome tightness in his own chest. He saw the genuine love and trust between them. She was the boy's anchor, his sanctuary, and he, Walter Thorne, was here to rip that sanctuary away. For the first time, he questioned the cold mechanics of his plan. He was providing the boy with wealth, security, a future, but he was taking away the only warmth that child had ever known. Lillian stood and faced him again, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, but her resolve was like steel. "I am his teacher, Mr. Thorne. I would like your permission to visit, to ensure his transition is a smooth one, to continue his lessons." It was a demand disguised as a request, a way for her to keep watch over both Arthur and him. His first instinct was to refuse, to sever all ties to this place and its painful purity. But looking at her, at the defiant light that burned in her moss-green eyes, he found himself unable to say no. This woman was a force, a small, unshakable bastion of decency, and in that moment, the nature of his quest shifted. He had come for the boy, to settle a debt, but now a new, far more dangerous objective began to form in the shadows of his mind. He wanted to see that defiant light up close. He wanted to understand it. He wanted to see if it would flicker or burn even brighter in his own dark world. The obsession had begun. It was not for the boy. It was for the guardian. "You may visit, Miss Hayes," Walter said, his voice a low murmur that sealed their fates. "I will insist upon it." The journey to Walter Thorne's mansion was a study in silence. Arthur sat ramrod straight on the plush leather seat of the Ford Model T, his small hands clasped in his lap, his knuckles white. He looked out the window, but his gaze was distant, seeing not the blur of the city passing by, but the fading image of Lillian's face on the orphanage steps. He was a small, solemn island in an ocean of opulent upholstery. Walter sat opposite him, the silence a palpable thing between them. He was a master of intimidating men into talking, of using silence as a weapon. But with this child, the quiet was a fortress he did not know how to breach. He'd ordered his tailor to craft a new suit for the boy and filled a bedroom with every toy a child could desire. A miniature train set, lead soldiers, a handsome wooden rocking horse. He had approached the task of fatherhood as he did his business, with resources and strategy. He was quickly discovering that a child's heart could not be acquired like a warehouse of illicit Canadian whiskey. "We're almost there," Walter said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space. Arthur flinched slightly, but offered no reply, keeping his eyes fixed on the world outside. The car turned off the main thoroughfare, passing through a set of imposing wrought iron gates that swung open as if by magic. A long, winding driveway, lined with ancient oak trees, led to a stone mansion that looked less like a home and more like a monument to wealth and solitude. It was a Gothic beast of grey stone and dark ivy, with tall, narrow windows that looked like suspicious eyes watching their approach. Eugene brought the car to a silent stop before the heavy oak doors. A butler, as old and unmoving as the house itself, opened the door for Walter. Walter then turned and opened the door for Arthur, a gesture of paternal care that felt rehearsed and clumsy. The boy stepped out, his small size dwarfed by the sheer scale of the entrance. He tilted his head back, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. "Welcome home, Arthur," Walter said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. The shoulder was bird-like and fragile beneath his large hand. Inside, the mansion was even more intimidating. A cavernous grand hall with a checkerboard marble floor stretched before them. The footsteps echoed, each one a lonely pronouncement in the vast, still air. A colossal staircase swept upwards into the shadows. The place was immaculate, polished to a miller shine, but it was profoundly silent. It was a house that held its breath, waiting for a life that had never begun. Walter led the boy up the stairs to his new room. It was a chamber fit for a prince, with a large four-poster bed, a desk overlooking the sprawling gardens, and shelves overflowing with the promised toys. The miniature train was already chugging silently along its track, a perfect, lifeless loop. Arthur stood in the doorway, refusing to cross the threshold. He looked at the rocking horse with its painted-on smile, at the legion of lead soldiers standing in perfect formation. He saw not an invitation to play, but an exhibit in a museum. Nothing here was his. "This is all for you," Walter said, a hint of frustration in his tone. He didn't understand. He had provided everything. What more could there be? The boy finally spoke, his voice a tiny whisper in the cavernous room. "Can Miss Hayes come visit?" The question struck Walter with the force of a physical blow. Of all the things he had given the boy, the only thing he wanted was the one thing Walter couldn't provide: her, the warmth of her presence, the light in her eyes. "Yes," Walter found himself saying, the words surrendering before his mind could object. "She will visit. To continue your lessons." The first visit was arranged for 2 days later. To Lillian, those 2 days were an eternity of worry. She pictured Arthur lost in that cold, imposing house, with that cold, imposing man. When she arrived, driven by the silent Eugene, her fears were immediately confirmed. The mansion was a gilded prison, beautiful and utterly devoid of warmth. She was led by the butler to Arthur's room, her sensible shoes making soft, apologetic sounds on the marble floor. She found him sitting on the edge of his enormous bed, not playing with any of the extravagant toys, but holding a single worn wooden block she recognized from the orphanage playroom. He was holding on to the last piece of his old life. His face lit up when he saw her, a true, radiant smile that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. He ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist and burying his face in her dress. "Lillian," he cried, his voice muffled. She knelt and hugged him tightly, stroking his hair. "Hello, my love. I told you I would come." She felt a fierce, protective anger towards Walter Thorne. How could he not see that this was what the boy needed? Not toys, but touch. Not a mansion, but a home. From the doorway, Walter watched them. He'd been standing there for a moment, unseen. He saw the way the boy clung to her, the easy affection with which she comforted him. A complex, bitter cocktail of emotions churned within him: envy, admiration, and a strange, hollow ache of inadequacy. She possessed a natural grace and warmth that he could only observe from a distance, like a man freezing outside a window, watching a family gathered around a fire. Lillian looked up and saw him, her expression hardening. She stood, keeping a protective hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone crisp, "thank you for allowing me to come." "He is the one who asked for you," Walter replied, stepping into the room. It felt smaller with him in it, the air charged with his presence. "It seems my efforts to make him comfortable have been insufficient. He is a child who has lost everything, Mr. Thorne," Lillian said, her voice sharp with a reprimand she did not try to hide. "He doesn't need a room full of possessions. He needs consistency. He needs reassurance. He needs a heart." The accusation hung in the air between them. Walter's jaw tightened. Any other person who spoke to him with such insolence would have regretted it deeply. But with her, the words didn't anger him so much as they landed. They found their mark in the empty spaces inside him. "I am providing for him," he stated, his voice low and defensive. "Providing is not the same as nurturing," she shot back. And so their strange ritual began. Lillian visited 3 times a week. She would arrive in the afternoon and transform the cold, princely bedroom into a classroom, a sanctuary. She brought well-loved books from the orphanage, their pages softened with use. They worked on arithmetic with chalk on a small slate and read stories of faraway lands. During these hours, Arthur would become a different child. He would laugh, ask questions, and the haunted look in his eyes would recede. Walter would often find reasons to be nearby. He would stand in the shadowed hallway, listening to the murmur of her voice as she read, a sound that was as soothing and out of place in his house as a songbird. He would watch from his study as she and Arthur walked in the garden, her head bent towards his, pointing out a flower or a butterfly. He saw things he hadn't expected. He saw the fierce loyalty of his men towards him, how they treated his presence with a reverence that bordered on fear. But he also saw how they softened their expressions when they saw Lillian leading Arthur by the hand. He saw the luxury of his life through her eyes, the decadent waste of it, the profound emptiness it concealed. And Lillian, against her better judgment, began to see things she hadn't expected either. One afternoon, she saw Walter attempting to show Arthur how to assemble a model Ford T, his large, capable hands looking clumsy and uncertain with the tiny parts. She saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes, quickly masked when Arthur showed little interest. She saw not a monster, but a man profoundly out of his depth, wrestling with a role he had no script for. The tension between them was a constant, simmering thing, because in the way his eyes followed her as she moved through a room, a dark, intense scrutiny that made her feel both threatened and seen. It was in the way she would challenge him, her chin held high, refusing to be intimidated by his power or his wealth. One rainy afternoon, as her lesson was ending, he was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs, holding a delicate porcelain cup. "My housekeeper made tea," he said. It was not a request. She followed him into a vast library, where a small fire crackled in the hearth. The room was lined, floor to ceiling, with books, though she suspected they were more for appearance than for reading. "How is he progressing?" Walter asked, gesturing for her to sit in a leather armchair that swallowed her small frame. "His reading is excellent. His arithmetic is improving," she said, her voice formal. "But he is lonely, Mr. Thorne. He has everything. He has no one," she corrected gently. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder about the man behind the formidable facade. "Does he remind you of yourself?" The question was audacious, a direct probe into his fortified heart. Walter froze, the cup halfway to his lips. His expression became unreadable, a mask of cold obsidian. For a long moment he said nothing. "I grew up with nothing, Miss Hayes," he finally said, his voice a low growl. "He will never know that life. That is all that matters." He was shutting her out, raising the walls she had momentarily breached. But she had seen it, a flicker of something raw and painful in his eyes before the mask fell, a shared loneliness. As she prepared to leave that evening, Eugene waiting with the car at the door, Walter stopped her in the grand hall. The echo of their footsteps had ceased, leaving a silence that felt charged and intimate. "Lillian," he said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice was a shock, a caress, and a warning all at once. She turned, her heart beating a little faster. "Stay for dinner," he said. It was not a question. It was a command wrapped in the thinnest veil of civility. She looked into his eyes, dark, possessive, and filled with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. She knew she should say no. She knew that every moment she spent in this house, with this man, was a step into a world of dangerous shadows. But she thought of Arthur, alone in his room upstairs, and she thought of the flicker of vulnerability she'd seen in the library. Her fear and her curiosity were at war, and, to her own astonishment, curiosity was winning. The worlds were not just colliding anymore. They were beginning to merge, and she was standing at the volatile, irresistible center. "Very well, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll stay." The invitation, when it came, was wrapped in the guise of responsibility. It was a week after Lillian had stayed for that silent, watchful dinner, a meal where the unspoken tension was the main course. Walter had found her at the end of a lesson, as she was helping Arthur put his books away. "Miss Hayes," he'd begun, his voice a low rumble that always seemed to quiet the air around him. "I believe it's time we discussed Arthur's long-term education. A private tutor, perhaps enrollment in a proper preparatory school next year. These are not matters to be discussed in a hallway." Lillian had looked up, suspicious. "We can speak in the library, Mr. Thorne." A slow, deliberate smile touched the corner of his mouth, a rare and unsettling event. I think more clearly away from this house. It is formal." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "I own a supper club downtown. The Gilded Cage. The music is pleasant. The food is adequate. We can speak there, tonight. Eugene will collect you at 8. It was, once again, a command disguised as a courtesy. Her mind screamed 1,000 reasons to refuse. A public outing with a known gangster. The impropriety was staggering. It would tarnish her reputation. More importantly, it would draw her deeper into his world, a world she knew was built on foundations of violence and fear. But a traitorous whisper of curiosity answered him. She wanted to see it. She wanted to see the king in his court, to understand the source of the power that clung to him like a shroud. And perhaps, if she saw the full, unvarnished truth of his life, it would be monstrous enough to finally sever the strange, magnetic pull he exerted on her. "For Arthur's sake, then," she agreed, her voice cool, betraying none of the turmoil within. At precisely 8 o'clock, the sleek black Ford T was waiting. Lillian had chosen her best dress, a simple navy blue silk that fell to her calves, with a modest neckline and long sleeves. It was the epitome of respectability. Yet, as she stepped out of the car into the electric hum of the city night, she felt as plain and out of place as a sparrow in a flock of peacocks. The Gilded Cage had no sign. Its entrance was a discreet, unmarked door in a narrow alley, guarded by a man whose shoulders seemed wider than the doorway itself. He nodded at Walter's approach, pulling the door open to reveal not a club, but a wave of sound and light that crashed over Lillian, stealing her breath. The air was a warm, hazy cloud of perfume and cigar smoke, a river of illegal champagne, served in wide, shallow coupes, flowed from table to table. On a raised stage at the far end of the long room, a jazz band was in full swing, the wail of a saxophone weaving a lament through the frantic, joyful rhythm of the piano and drums. It was music that felt like sin and salvation all at once. The room was filled with the city's elite politicians, irises, and men with watchful eyes who looked a great deal like Walter, mingling with flappers in glittering dresses that shimmied and swayed, their bobbed hair catching the dim golden light. This was the heart of the Roaring Twenties, a frantic, beautiful party on the edge of a volcano, and Walter Thorne was its master. As he led her through the throng, the crowd parted for him. Voices lowered, heads nodded in respect. He moved with an easy, predatory grace, his presence a silent announcement of his authority. He led her to a secluded booth in a raised alcove, draped in velvet, offering a perfect view of the entire club while maintaining an air of privacy. "It's overwhelming," Lillian admitted, her voice nearly lost in the intoxicating chaos. "It's a distraction," Walter replied, settling opposite her. A waiter appeared instantly, placing a bottle of champagne in an ice bucket beside them, without a word. "People come here to forget what's outside, or what's inside." He poured 2 glasses, his movements economical and precise. He pushed one towards her, to Arthur's future. She hesitated, then took a small, defiant sip. The bubbles tingled on her tongue, a taste of rebellion. They spoke of Arthur, as promised. They discussed tutors and curriculums, but the conversation felt like a veneer, a polite script they were both reciting, while the real dialogue happened in the charged glances, the spaces between words. He asked her about her life before the orphanage, and she told him of her quiet upbringing in the countryside, of her passion for books, and her belief in the power of education. He listened with an unnerving intensity, his dark eyes never leaving her face, making her feel as if he were reading the hidden chapters of her soul. "You believe you can save the world with books, Lillian?" he asked, the use of her first name a soft, deliberate intimacy. "I believe you can save a child's world with them," she corrected. "You give them a place to go when they have nowhere else to be." "And where do you go?" he countered, his voice a low murmur. The question caught her off guard. She had nowhere else to be. The orphanage, the children, that was her entire world. She looked out at the sea of dancing bodies, at the shimmering dresses and reckless laughter, and felt a pang of a life unlived. The band shifted its tempo, the frantic beats slowing to a deep bluesy throb. The saxophone began to sing a melody so full of longing it made the heart ache. Couples moved to the small dance floor, pressing close together, swaying as one. Walter stood, extending a hand to her. "A discussion of the future is no excuse to ignore the present. I'm not much of a dancer, Mr. Thorne." "Walter," he corrected softly, "and I will lead." His hand was large and warm, and when her smaller hand rested in it, a jolt, sharp and undeniable, shot up her arm. She let him lead her to the floor. The moment he turned and drew her in, the chaotic noise of the club faded to a distant hum. His left hand rested on the small of her back, a firm, warm brand that seemed to seep through the fabric of her dress, claiming her. Her other hand rested hesitantly on his broad shoulder. They began to move, and she realized he was a magnificent dancer. He moved with a fluid, confident grace that belied his formidable size. He didn't just follow the music, he seemed to command it. Lillian, who was used to clumsy steps at church socials, found herself moving effortlessly, as if she had been dancing with him her entire life. The world narrowed to the space of a few square feet. The smell of his cologne, a subtle scent of sandalwood and something distinctly masculine, filled her senses. She could feel the hard planes of his chest, the steady, powerful beat of his heart against hers. She tilted her head back and looked up at him. In the dim, golden light, the hardness in his face had softened. The coldness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dark, smoldering fire that was focused entirely on her. The gangster, the intimidating benefactor, the lonely man in the library, they all melted away, leaving only the man holding her in his arms. In that moment, she wasn't afraid. She felt utterly, terrifyingly safe. He leaned in closer, his lips near her ear. "You see?" he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. Not so overwhelming. A slow, languid heat spread through her veins. Her guard, so carefully constructed, crumbled to dust. For one insane, suspended moment, she wanted nothing more than to close her eyes, rest her head on his chest, and stay there forever. It was then that the illusion shattered. She felt the shift before she saw it. A subtle tensing in the muscles of his back, a sudden stillness in his movements. His gaze lifted from her face, looking over her shoulder towards their table. The warmth in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a flat, cold purpose that chilled her to the bone. The song ended. He didn't let her go immediately, but his hand on her back was no longer a caress. It was a shield, holding her in place as he scanned the room. Eugene had appeared at their table, his face a grim, stoic mask. He leaned in and whispered something to Walter. Walter's jaw clenched. The mask of the charming host had not been put on. It had been taken off. This was the real Walter Thorne. "Excuse me," he said to her, his voice devoid of all its earlier warmth. He guided her back to the table, his touch now impersonal, efficient. "I have a business matter to attend to." He walked away with Eugene, and she watched as he was swallowed by the crowd. The music started up again, a lively, cheerful tune that felt like a mockery. Lillian sat alone in the velvet booth, the magic of the dance evaporating like a dream upon waking. The club suddenly seemed loud, garish, and dangerous. 5 minutes later, she saw him. He was standing near a side exit, speaking to two of his men. Between them was another man, well dressed, but pale with fear. Walter said something Lillian couldn't hear, his expression unreadable, and then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of his head. His two men grabbed the pale man by the arms and swiftly, brutally, hustled him out the side door into the alley. Lillian caught a glimpse of the man's terrified face, a flash of a bloody lip before the door swung shut. Walter stood there for a moment, adjusting his cuffs. He turned, and his eyes met hers across the crowded room. There was no apology in his gaze, no explanation. There was only the cold, hard statement of facts. This is my world. This is who I am. The melody of the evening had been beautiful, intoxicating, but the shadow that had just fallen was the truth. The ride home was steeped in a thick, suffocating silence. He did not try to explain, and she did not ask. When the car stopped in front of her modest boarding house, he simply got out and opened her door. "Thank you for the evening, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice a stiff, formal whisper. "Lillian," he said, his voice low. He reached out as if to touch her arm, but then let his hand fall to his side. She turned and walked up the steps without looking back, the ghost of his hand on her back, the memory of the dance, a beautiful, poisonous thing. She now understood the name of his club perfectly. It was a gilded cage, and she had been an exotic bird invited in for a song, only to witness the hawk descending on its prey. Sleep offered Lillian no escape. She dreamt of dancing in Walter's arms, the saxophone weaving a spell around them, only for the polished dance floor to crack open, revealing a dark, bloody abyss beneath. She awoke with a gasp to the cold grey light of dawn, the phantom sensation of his hand on her back still burning, the memory of the terrified man's face seared into her mind. The glamour of the gilded cage had been a lie, a beautiful mask on a skull. She felt naive, a fool who had been seduced not by the man, but by the dangerous fantasy he projected. Every ideal she held, dear peace, kindness, safety, was a currency his world did not trade in, and she, by her presence, had tacitly endorsed it. Worse, she had brought Arthur into the orbit of that darkness. Her resolve hardened with the morning light. This had to end. She did not wait for her scheduled lesson. She took a trolley to the opulent neighborhood, her jaw set, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She marched up the steps of the mansion and announced to the butler, in a voice that brooked no argument, that she needed to see Mr. Thorne immediately. She found him in his study, the room where he commanded his empire. He was on the telephone, his voice low and authoritative. He saw her enter, and a flicker of something surprise, pleasure, crossed his features. He ended the call abruptly. Lillian, an unexpected visit. He rose from his chair, but she held up her hand, stopping him. "Don't," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but firm. "I am not here for a social call, Mr. Thorne. I am here to tender my resignation." The air in the room grew still. His expression shuttered, becoming cold and impenetrable. "Explain yourself. I saw you last night," she said, her words coming in a rush of righteous anger. "I saw what happened by that door. I saw the truth of your world. It is a world of brutality and fear, and I will not have Arthur raised in its shadow. I cannot, in good conscience, continue to legitimize your guardianship by my presence here. He needs to be somewhere safe, somewhere good." Walter moved around the desk, his movements slow, deliberate, like a panther stalking its prey. "This house is safe. My world does not cross its threshold. It already has," she cried, taking a step back. "It's in the very air we breathe. It's in the silence of your hallways and the fear in your servants' eyes. You cannot build a wall high enough to keep the rot of your business out, because the rot is in you." The words struck him, but he did not flinch. He simply stopped, a few feet from her, his gaze intense, possessive, and you believe you can simply walk away, that I would allow it. You don't get to allow it, she shot back, her courage fueled by desperation. This isn't one of your business arrangements. This is a child's life. My conscience is not for sale. His rejection of her decision was absolute, not just in his words, but in the dangerous glint in his eyes. He saw her defiance, not as a moral stand, but as a personal betrayal. The more she pulled away, the tighter his obsession coiled around her. He had brought this beacon of light into his life, and he would not let it be extinguished or removed. "You are not leaving," he said. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact, from a man who bent the world to his will. "You will continue your lessons. You will continue to see Arthur. You will continue to see me." Before she could argue further, the phone on his desk rang, a shrill, insistent summons. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills passing between them, before he turned to answer it. Lillian stood, trembling with fury and a terrifying sense of helplessness, trapped by the sheer force of his will. Miles away, in a smoke-filled back room of a rival's speakeasy that stank of stale beer and desperation, Clarence the Butcher Malone slammed a deck of cards onto a scarred wooden table. Malone was everything Walter Thorne was not, physically brutish, loud, and preferring the blunt instrument of fear to the scalpel of influence. He was a relic of an older, less sophisticated era of crime, and he hated Thorne for his polish, his success, and his untouchability. "For 2 years I've been looking for a way to get at Thorne," Malone growled to his lieutenants. "The man has no weaknesses, no women, no gambling debts, no vices we can use." A small, weaselly man in a stained suit cleared his throat nervously. "Boss, there might be something." Malone turned his piggish eyes on the informant. "Spit it out, Stanley." "Thorne. He's been seen at the Gilded Cage a few nights back with a woman." Malone laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A dame? Thorne's got 100 dames. So what?" "No, boss, this one was different," the informant insisted. "She wasn't a flapper, dressed plain, a school teacher they say. And here's the thing, she's the teacher for the orphan kid he just adopted, the Kowalski boy." The room went quiet. Malone leaned forward, his massive frame creaking the chair. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He had spent years trying to batter down the walls of Walter Thorne's fortress. And all this time Thorne had quietly built a door and handed him the key. A teacher, Malone mused, his mind racing, and a kid, a ready-made family. He slammed a beefy fist on the table, making the whiskey glasses jump. A man with nothing to lose is a fortress, but a man with something to lose. A man with something to lose is a man you can break. Lillian left the mansion that day without a resolution. She felt as though she had run headfirst into a granite wall. The encounter left her drained and deeply unsettled. She walked the few blocks from the trolley stop to her boarding house in the fading afternoon light, her mind replaying Walter's possessive words, "You are not leaving." The street was quiet, the residents already inside for their evening meals. As she approached her building, a dark sedan, a Packard, not a Ford, pulled away from the curb opposite her, its engine a low growl. It slowed as it passed her. The back window rolled down, and a man with a scarred face and cold eyes looked directly at her. He didn't speak, he just looked. Then the car sped up and disappeared around the corner. Lillian's blood ran cold. It was a violation, a clear and deliberate message. She hurried up the steps to her boarding house, her key fumbling in the lock. On the small stoop, placed directly in front of her door, was a single, perfect white rose. Tucked into its stem was a small, folded piece of paper. With trembling hands she opened it. The note contained only 6 words, written in a crude, blocky script. "Thorne can't protect you everywhere." The fear was immediate and suffocating. This was not a performance in a club. This was real. The shadow had detached itself from Walter's world and had followed her home. It knew where she lived. It knew who she was. She didn't even go inside. She turned and ran, the rose and its terrible message clutched in her fist. She hailed a taxi, her voice a frantic squeak, and gave the driver Walter's address. When she burst into his study for the second time that day, her hair was disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. She threw the rose and the note onto his polished desk. Walter took one look at them, then at her pale, stricken face, and the cold fury that rose in him was a terrifying thing to behold. It was a silent, black rage that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. "This is your world, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "This is the price of knowing you." He rounded the desk and gripped her by the shoulders. His touch, surprisingly gentle, but his eyes were blazing with a homicidal fire. It was not directed at her. It was directed at the man who had dared to touch what was his. The full weight of his actions crashed down upon him. He had wanted her, this pure, defiant light. His obsession, his possessiveness, his refusal to let her go, had not protected her. It had painted a target on her back. He had sought to own the flame, and in doing so, he had exposed it to the howling wind. The price of his obsession was her safety, and that was a price he would not, could not, allow to be paid. "This ends now," he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. "Whoever did this will pay. I swear it on my life. Do you believe love can conquer all odds? Tell us in the comments what you think Lillian should do." Walter's rage was a cold, controlled thing, far more terrifying than any loud outburst. It settled in his eyes, turning them to chips of obsidian. He did not try to comfort Lillian with empty words or placating gestures. He acted. Within the hour, his entire mansion was a hive of quiet, purposeful activity. Eugene was dispatched with a set of orders. The housekeeper, Mrs. Beatrice, was instructed to pack bags for both Lillian and Arthur essentials for a long stay. "What are you doing?" Lillian asked, her initial terror giving way to a new kind of dread. She felt like a pawn in a game whose rules she was only just beginning to comprehend. "I am moving you," Walter stated, his tone leaving no room for debate. He was standing by the window, staring out at the darkening grounds, as if he could see Clarence Malone's shadow in every corner. "I have a property upstate, a house by a lake. It's isolated, quiet. No one knows I own it. You and Arthur will go there tonight. You will stay there until I have finished this, she repeated, her voice trembling. "Do you mean until you have dragged yourself down to his level, until there's more blood?" He turned from the window to face her, and the raw agony in his expression silenced her. It was not the face of a cold-blooded killer planning his next move. It was the face of a man who had failed in his most sacred duty. "He threatened you, Lillian," Walter said, his voice a low, guttural rasp. "He threatened the boy. There is no negotiation after a line like that is crossed. There is only an ending, and I will not have you here to witness it. I won't be your prisoner," she protested, though her words lacked conviction. The feel of the threatening note was still a phantom chill on her fingertips. "You will not be a target," he corrected grimly. "This is no longer about what you want or what I want. It is about what is necessary. It is about keeping you alive." 2 hours later, under the cloak of a moonless night, they were gone. A second, nondescript car, not the familiar Ford T, carried them out of the city. Lillian sat in the back, a sleeping Arthur's head resting in her lap. She stroked his soft hair, her heart aching with a confusing mix of resentment and a strange, terrifying gratitude. He was sending her away, controlling her life, and yet he was doing it to protect her. The monster and the guardian were one and the same, and her heart could no longer tell them apart. The country house was beautiful. It was a lie to call it a house. It was a sprawling timber and stone lodge nestled among pine trees on the shore of a vast placid lake. The air was clean and crisp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. A quiet, elderly couple, the caretakers, greeted them with deferential bows and showed them to their rooms. It was a paradise, and it was a cage. The first few days were a blur of disorientation. Lillian and Arthur walked the wooded trails, skipped stones across the glassy surface of the lake, and read books by the massive stone fireplace. It was peaceful, idyllic, and utterly false. They were safe, but they were in exile. Every distant sound of a car on the main road made Lillian's heart leap into her throat. Every night, she dreamt of gunshots and Walter's cold, determined face. On the fourth day, a package arrived, delivered by a discreet courier. It was a simple, unmarked box. Inside were 2 items. For Arthur, a new, hand-carved wooden soldier, more detailed and handsome than any in his set. For Lillian, there was a letter. The envelope was made of thick, cream-colored paper. Her name was written on the front in a strong, masculine script that was surprisingly neat. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter inside was brutally short. "Lillian, I trust you are safe, that the boy is well. There is nothing to report from here, which is for the best. See that he continues his studies. The air there is better for him than the city smoke. Walter." There was no warmth, no affection, and yet Lillian clutched the paper to her chest as if it were a precious jewel. He was a man of action, not words. For him to sit and write a letter, it was an act of profound intimacy. He was thinking of them. He was checking on them. The words said little, but the space between the lines screamed his concern. She wrote back that evening, the nib of her pen scratching in the profound silence of the lodge. "Walter, we are both safe. The house is lovely, and Arthur enjoys the lake. He misses the city, I think, but he is a resilient boy. I miss it less. Thank you for the soldier. It was a kind thought. We are continuing our lessons. I pray that you are safe as well, Lillian." And so their strange, epistolary courtship began. Every few days, a letter would arrive. His were always short, practical, confirming his safety and inquiring about theirs. But she learned to read the hidden language of his correspondence. When he wrote, "Your absence has made the house quiet," she understood. He was saying, "I am desperately lonely." When he wrote, "Do not worry for my safety. I am a careful man," she knew he was in the midst of a storm. Her letters became her confessional. She told him of Arthur's small triumphs, of a frog he had caught, of a chapter he read aloud without stumbling, and in the quiet solitude of the nights, she confessed the war in her own heart. "I find myself thinking not of the man I fear," she wrote one night, her cheeks flushing in the firelight, "but the man who danced with me. I do not know how to reconcile the two." One afternoon a larger crate arrived from the St. Jude orphanage. Mrs. Gable had sent on the last of Arthur's personal effects, a small wooden box containing the few keepsakes his parents had left behind. Arthur was napping, so Lillian decided to sort through it for him. Inside were a few faded photographs, his father's worn pocket watch, and a small leather-bound diary. It belonged to Hazel, Arthur's mother. Lillian knew she shouldn't read it, but an irresistible pull urged her on. She sat by the window, overlooking the lake, and opened the delicate book. Most of it was filled with the simple, loving entries of a young mother. But the last few entries, dated just before her and Stanley's death, were different. They were filled with fear. October 12th, Hazel had written, "Stanley's worried. He saw something at the docks, something he shouldn't have. It involves Mr. Malone, a shipment that wasn't whiskey. Stanley told Mr. Thorne. He says Thorne will handle it, that we are to trust him. But I see the fear in my husband's eyes. Malone is a butcher, not a businessman." The final entry, dated the day before they were killed in what the papers had called a robbery gone wrong, was terrifyingly clear. October 17th. Malone's men were watching the house today. Stanley told me to take Arthur and go to my sister's. He is meeting with Mr. Thorne tonight to give a formal statement. He says Thorne will protect us. He says his loyalty is to Thorne. I pray that is enough." Lillian dropped the diary, as if it had burned her. The story she had been told, the story everyone knew, was a lie. Stanley and Hazel's death was not random. It was a targeted execution. Malone had silenced a witness, and Walter had not just adopted the son of a loyal employee out of a vague sense of duty. He had adopted the son of a man who had died for him. His promise to Stanley was not just a debt of honor, it was a vow of vengeance. He wasn't just fighting a rival, he was hunting his friend's murderer. Everything shifted. The entire landscape of her understanding tilted on its axis. Walter's coldness, his obsession with safety, his absolute refusal to back down from Malone, it all snapped into focus. This was personal. It had always been personal. She stood up, the diary clutched in her hand, and looked out at the peaceful, sun-dappled lake. The safety of this place suddenly felt like a cowardice. Walter was in Chicago, preparing to walk into a firestorm, driven by a grief and a duty she had never understood. And she was here, hiding. But now she held the truth. She held the motive. She held the one thing that could perhaps change the nature of the fight. Her love for him, which had been a timid, flickering flame, now roared into a bonfire of certainty. She could not let him face this alone. She could not hide in this gilded cage while the man she loved prepared to waltz with death. She went to her room and began to pack. Chicago, in Walter Thorne's absence, had held its breath. The underworld simmered, whispers and rumors flying like sparks in a dry forest. Everyone knew a storm was coming. Clarence Malone, emboldened by his adversary's apparent retreat, grew louder and more arrogant. He took over neutral territory, bragged in his speakeasies that Thorne had lost his nerve, that he had been run out of his own city by a woman and a child. Malone was a bear, poking a sleeping lion with a stick, too foolish to realize the lion was not sleeping, but watching and waiting. Walter had used the time to meticulously set his trap. He was a master strategist, moving his pieces across the city's chessboard with lethal precision. He had his men gather intelligence, document Malone's every move, and identify the weak links in his organization. He wasn't planning a simple gangland hit. He was planning an annihilation. He intended to dismantle Malone's empire so completely that nothing but dust and cautionary tallies would remain. The final piece was to be a face-to-face meeting, arranged through intermediaries, at a neutral location, a vast, abandoned textile warehouse on the industrial edge of the city. Malone believed Thorne was coming to negotiate a truce, to beg for terms. He would come flanked by his best men, ready to gloat, ready to issue demands. Walter knew it was a trap. Malone intended for him to walk in and never walk out. What Malone didn't know was that Walter was walking into the trap willingly, because he had already laid a bigger, more deadly one around it. The night of the meeting was cold and bleak, a low mist creeping in from Lake Michigan, shrouding the city in a damp, gray veil. Walter stood before the mirror in his bedroom, the same room Lillian had found so cold and princely. He was not dressed in his usual impeccable suit. Instead, he wore dark trousers, a simple white shirt, and a leather shoulder holster. The weight of the .45 automatic was a familiar, grim comfort. He looked at his reflection, but he did not see the powerful gangster. He saw the hollow-eyed man Stanley Kowalski had made a promise to. He saw the face of the man who had terrified Lillian Hayes. He had built an empire of shadows, and now he had to become the darkest shadow of all to protect the only light he had ever known. He picked up her last letter from his nightstand. "I pray that you are safe as well." He folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, a fragile talisman against the violence to come. As Eugene drove him towards the warehouse, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon. Lillian's train was pulling into Union Station. She had left a note for the caretakers, a large sum of cash, and instructions to keep Arthur safe until she sent for him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of love and fear. She had no plan, no weapon but the truth in Hazel's diary. She only knew she could not let Walter sacrifice himself on the altar of his past. She hailed a taxi, her voice clear and steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I need to go to the old Crawford textile warehouse. By the river." The driver gave her a nervous look. "That ain't a place for a lady, miss. Not at this time of night." "I'm meeting someone," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Please just drive." The warehouse loomed out of the mist, a skeletal hulk of brick and broken windows. Eugene stopped the car a block away. "Boss, my men are in position. On your signal." Walter nodded, his face a granite mask. "Wait for it." He got out and walked the final block alone, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. He pushed open the massive, groaning metal door and stepped inside. The interior was a cavernous space, filled with the ghosts of industry. Dim light filtered through the grimy upper windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. In the center of the vast concrete floor, Malone was waiting, flanked by a dozen of his men, all holding shotguns and Tommy guns. It was a crude, overwhelming show of force. "Thorne," Malone grunted, a triumphant sneer on his face. "I knew you'd come crawling. Ready to talk about your retirement?" "I'm here to talk about Stanley Kowalski," Walter said, his voice dangerously calm, echoing in the huge space. Malone's sneer faltered for a second. "Don't know the name. He worked for me," Walter continued, his eyes locking on Malone's. "He died because he saw a shipment you brought in, a shipment of narcotics, not liquor. He was going to testify against you, so you had him and his wife murdered and made it look like a robbery." Malone laughed, a harsh, dismissive bark. "You got no proof of that." "I don't need proof," Walter said, his hand hovering near his jacket. "I only need the truth." That was the signal. From the high catwalks and shadowed corners, a dozen rifles appeared, the glint of their barrels catching the dim light. Red dots from laser sights, a new, terrifying innovation, blossomed on the chests of Malone's men. They were surrounded, outmaneuvered, caught in a perfectly executed crossfire. Malone's men froze, their eyes wide with panic. Malone's face turned purple with rage. "You son of a..." But before he could finish, a sound from the main entrance made every man in the room turn. The great metal door creaked open, and a lone figure was silhouetted against the misty night. A woman. Walter. Lillian. For the first time in his adult life, Walter Thorne felt the icy grip of pure, unadulterated fear. His blood ran cold. He had planned for every contingency, every variable except this. He'd built a fortress to keep her safe, and she had just walked onto the battlefield. "Lillian, get out of here, now," he roared, his voice cracking with a terror that stunned his own men. She ignored him, walking forward into the dim light, her eyes only for him. She was holding the small, leather-bound diary. "You don't have to do this," she pleaded, her voice echoing with desperate sincerity. "Vengeance won't bring them back. It will only destroy you." Malone saw his chance. The perfect stalemate was broken. The untouchable Walter Thorne had a vulnerability, and it was standing right in the middle of the floor. "Well, well," Malone chuckled, a wicked glee spreading across his face. "The schoolteacher. Grab her." Two of his men lunged for Lillian, but Walter moved faster than seemed humanly possible. He drew his pistol and fired twice. The shots were deafening in the enclosed space. The two men crumpled to the ground. It was an act of pure protective instinct, but it broke the spell. The standoff was over. The warehouse erupted into a maelstrom of gunfire. Walter shoved Lillian behind a stack of old shipping crates, shielding her with his own body. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a primal snarl. He came up firing, a cold, efficient machine of death. His men on the catwalks opened fire, raining down bullets on Malone's exposed thugs. It was chaos. The air filled with the roar of guns, the splintering of wood, the ping of bullets ricocheting off metal. Lillian huddled behind the crates, her hands over her ears, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. This was the reality of his world, loud, brutal, and final. The firefight was short and bloody. Walter's strategic advantage was overwhelming. One by one, Malone's men fell. Soon, only Malone himself was left, crouched behind a rusted piece of machinery, firing blindly. Walter advanced on him, reloading his weapon with a steady hand. He was no longer a businessman. He was an executioner. He cornered Malone, kicking the Tommy gun from his hands. He pressed the barrel of his .45 against the terrified man's forehead. "This is for Stanley," Walter gritted out, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Walter, no." Lillian's voice cut through his rage. She had emerged from behind the crates, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate love. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Look at me. This isn't you. This is the monster he wants you to be. Don't let him win. Don't become him." He looked from Malone's terrified, sweating face to hers. He saw the future she represented, a life of light, of peace, of Arthur's laughter filling the silent halls of his mansion. He saw redemption, and he saw that pulling the trigger would destroy that future forever. It would chain him to the ghost of Stanley Kowalski and the violence of his past, leaving no room for her. His hand trembled. The choice was clear. Embrace the violence that had defined him, or abandon it for the love that could save him. With a roar of frustration and grief, Walter lowered the gun. He slammed the butt of it against the side of Malone's head, sending the man sprawling to the ground, unconscious but alive. He turned to Lillian, his chest heaving, his face a mask of anguish. The battle was over. The gun smoke was clearing, and in the sudden, ringing silence, they stood. Two worlds collided, one saved, one shattered. Forever bound by the waltz with death, they had just survived. The aftermath of the warehouse battle was not a triumphant victory march, but a quiet, solemn dismantling. The sirens that wailed in the distance were not for Walter's men, who melted back into the city's shadows as silently as they had appeared. They were for Clarence Malone and the remnants of his crew, who were delivered, bound and bruised, to the doorstep of the Chicago Police Department, along with Hazel Kowalski's diary and a detailed, anonymous tip about a certain narcotics shipment. Walter Thorne did not wait for the consequences to find him. He walked out to meet them. The firefire had been a point of no return. To truly leave that world, he couldn't just defeat his enemies. He had to burn the empire that had created them. He and Lillian returned to the mansion, the silence in the car heavy with unspoken emotions. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and the stark reality of what they had survived. He led her not to the study or the library, but to the grand ballroom, a vast, dust-sheeted space that had not been used in years. In the center of the room, under a cavernous crystal chandelier, he stopped and finally turned to face her properly. His face was smudged with grime, his shirt torn, but his eyes held a clarity she had never seen before. The shadows were gone. "He will talk," Walter said, his voice low and raspy. "Malone will name me. The police will have questions about the warehouse, and I will answer them." Lillian's heart clenched. "What does that mean?" "It means I am done," he said, a great weariness in his voice. "I built this life on a foundation of my father's mistakes and my own anger. I kept a promise to Stanley with violence, but the only way to truly honor him is to give his son a life free of it, free of me, as I am now." He was surrendering, not just to the law, but to the hope she had shown him. He was choosing her, choosing Arthur, and choosing a future he had never believed himself worthy of. Over the next few days, Walter methodically deconstructed his life's work. He met with his lawyers, transferring ownership of his legitimate businesses, the supper clubs, the real estate, into a trust for Arthur. The speakeasies, the gambling dens, the entire illegal infrastructure was severed, cut loose to wither and die. He was paying his debts, not just to society, but to his own soul. When the police came, he went with them quietly. He offered no resistance, made no calls to powerful friends. The trial was a city-wide sensation. Walter Thorne, the untouchable phantom of Chicago's underworld, confessed to his role in orchestrating the confrontation, framing it as a necessary evil to stop a more dangerous criminal. He was convicted, but his cooperation and the undeniable evidence against Malone earned him a sentence that was seen as shockingly lenient: 5 years in a federal prison. To many, it was the end of an era. To Lillian, it was the beginning. She did not retreat. She did not hide. She brought Arthur back from the country house and moved into the vast, silent mansion. It was her home now, their home. She became the fierce guardian, not just of the boy, but of Walter's legacy and his future. She visited him in prison every week, traversing the long, sterile corridors, her presence a beacon of warmth in the cold, grey facility. They spoke through a thick plate of glass, their conversations carried over a crackling telephone line. They could not touch, but their connection grew deeper and more profound than it ever had in the charged intimacy of his mansion. He told her stories of his childhood, of the poverty and loneliness that had forged him. She told him of Arthur's progress at school, of the laughter that was finally starting to fill the empty halls of his home. She read to him from her favorite books, her voice a lifeline to the world he was fighting to rejoin. She loved him, and she showed him that love through the simple, unwavering act of being there. The years passed. The Roaring Twenties faded, giving way to the sober reality of a new decade. Arthur grew from a solemn boy into a bright, confident young man who excelled in his studies, his past a distant shadow rather than a defining scar. The day Walter was released, Lillian was there waiting for him, standing just outside the prison gates. He was thinner, with lines of hardship etched around his eyes, but the coldness was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet strength. He wore a simple, ill-fitting suit, a stark contrast to the tailored perfection of his former life. He stopped a few feet from her, a hesitant, uncertain look on his face. He was a stranger to this new world of freedom. Lillian closed the distance between them and rose on her toes, her hands cupping his face. She pressed her lips to his. It was their first kiss. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or desperate longing, but one of profound, patient love. It was a promise kept, a welcomed home. Their new life was not bathed in the glittering, artificial light of speakeasies, but in the soft, steady glow of the morning sun. Walter found he had a keen mind for legitimate business, and he channeled his formidable intellect into rebuilding a small, honest fortune. The mansion, once a monument to lonely power, became a true home, filled with the warmth of family, the scent of Beatrice's baking, and the sound of Arthur practicing the piano. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, Lillian found Walter sitting on the porch swing, watching a teenage Arthur throwing a baseball in the sprawling yard. He held a small sepia-toned photograph in his hands. It was the old picture from his desk, Stanley and Hazel, with a small, smiling Arthur between them. She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, the gesture now one of easy, comfortable affection. "Do you think he would be proud?" Walter asked, his voice a low murmur. Lillian looked at the strong, happy young man in the yard, then at the man beside her, the husband, the father, the good man he had fought so hard to become. His obsession had been a dangerous, possessive thing, born of darkness and control. But it hadn't been transformed, through sacrifice and her unwavering love, into a devotion that was patient, selfless, and redemptive. "He would be more than proud, Walter," she said, her fingers lacing with his. "He would be grateful." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, his eyes never leaving the bright future playing out before them. The debts were finally paid. The ghosts were at rest, and in the quiet light of a new day, the darkest soul had found its way home to the dawn. True strength is not found in controlling the world through power and fear, but in the courage to surrender to a love that demands a better version of yourself. Redemption is not a gift, but a choice, a difficult, painful, and beautiful journey from the shadows into the dawn, proving that no soul is ever truly lost as long as there is a light worth fighting for. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more timeless romances.